Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. You know, my LinkedIn feed is not only flooded with AI content, Jerry, as you know, but also content on what's happening at the Department of Education. There are so many questions, so much vulnerability, it feels, and we don't really know what's going to happen. But there are so many different players involved. What's happening? What's going to happen to, well, first of all, students, right? Individual schools, districts, at the state level. What is some of the impact going to be? But mostly, what are people afraid of? What are the questions they have? And how does it affect the EdTech industry? How does it affect the EdTech companies? So we have someone who's kind of central to it all to help us kind of get through the weeds, so to speak.
Yes. So our guest today is Collin Earnst, and he is from the EdTech Leadership Collective. And one of our colleagues heard him talk on a webinar and was very impressed with the view that he could give us, a higher level view, seeing what's going on and being very open-minded and, what do I want to say, just balanced view about the future of the Department of Education. So Collin, first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. And second of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the EdTech Leadership Collective is?
Yeah, Jerry, thanks. Thanks, Jerry and Jamie. I'm Collin Earnst. I'm founder and managing partner of the EdTech Leadership Collective, and we're a membership organization that brings together high-performing EdTech company leaders in a collaborative environment to support their success and their professional growth. So we create an environment where EdTech company leaders can come together, can compare experiences, share best practices, learn from each other, collaborate. Really, it's about creating community. And we have, right now, there's over 40 different EdTech companies whose employees are part of the collective, and they participate in professional peer groups and coaching. We also do some broader community conversations. We call them collective conversations. And that's the webinar session that you alluded to, Jared, where we really want to just get a broader group of leaders together to talk about what are we hearing, how are we approaching, how are we showing up as leaders?
Yes. Well, we know that the Department of Education has been a hot topic in the educational arena and the nation in general.
Yeah.
Can you start with telling us, first of all, can that department be eliminated? What can happen here?
Yeah, it's one of the questions we're hearing a lot from our members and from the community. And the short answer, can it be eliminated? It can't, but we know the president actually cannot unilaterally decide to eliminate the department. This takes an act of Congress. But what we also know at this point is eliminating the DOE does not have broad congressional support. So it's unlikely that their required 60 senators would be willing to move this to a vote. So that would take both Democrats and Republicans willing to move eliminating the DOE to a vote. So that seems unlikely, not impossible. It seems unlikely. But I think what's important for us in the education space to remember is, although it's unlikely, that may not stop congressional Republicans from putting forth those motions and trying. Again, I think it'd be hard to get those 60 votes, though.
Right. And what are the ramifications of that department being eliminated?
Well, I think one of the things we're looking right now is how it can be weakened, even if it isn't eliminated, because we know the president has significant influence over those cabinet level departments and how they function. Again, the president can't eliminate offices within the department like Title I as a program, or the Office of Civil Rights. Those can't be eliminated. Those, again, would take an act of Congress. But what we do know is the staffing cuts of those non-appointed employees can really have a significant impact and weaken the DOE's ability to do some of those responsibilities that we're familiar with. And so what I think a lot of us are thinking about is those staffing cuts at the DOE that we've already seen happen can really have some dire implications in terms of how we support our most vulnerable students, how we measure success, how we innovate as an industry, and how we ensure equitable education access and inclusive education. So I think the other thing to think about with the DOE, even if it's not eliminated, the president and the secretary can influence how the department sets its priorities, impacting the manner in which core policies are enforced. So I think these cuts are something, and the weakened DOE are something really to keep an eye on and present our risk.
So I'm hearing you say it may not be eliminated, but it could be weakened. Less people means we don't get the work done that needed to be taken care of.
And the priorities are diminished. That may have been high up on the list. And so you mentioned Title I, IDEA. So those have not been eliminated, correct? They've gone to different departments. Is that what I understand?
There's been talk of this. There's no changes that have happened so far, but there's some talk about would those programs be moved. So regardless of what happens to the DOE, those two programs stay intact. And any major changes to management or funding, that also would require an act of Congress, because Congress holds the power of the purse, the budget, and how it's spent. Okay. And what's important to bear in mind is there's fairly broad bipartisan support for both of those programs, in particular, Title I and IDEA. So elimination or significant reduction of those seems highly unlikely. There's talk about if the DOE were eliminated, those programs would be moved elsewhere. So the talk that we've heard a lot is they be moved to Health and Human Services and managed through that. But again, there's no movement on that as of yet. As we think about, are those programs moved? What's the fate of Title I and IDEA? There's concerns about, okay, is there going to be funding changes to those?
Right.
And at this point, we're not hearing anything that indicates that there's a funding change that may occur. From what I understand, the president will make initial recommendations on budget to Congress, and that should be coming in May, I believe. And what the department is signaling right now is there will be stable funding for Title I and potential increases for IDEA. And this was underscored a bit by the Secretary of Education just this past week at ASU GSV. So that's what we know currently about funding them. That doesn't mean there won't still be negative impacts of these programs if they end up being moved, as you said. So funding might be level, but moving, that's where there's some additional uncertainty.
Sure.
What withholding funds? So the funds are there, but what about withholding them from the states? Because we've heard about if districts do certain things, then they're not going to get this money. How is that possible that states and districts can't get that money? How does that work?
So that's what is called impoundment of funds. And legally, the president can't withhold funds permanently. Temporarily, yes. So this is something that the Nixon administration was unsuccessful in doing back in the mid-70s. It was for an issue unrelated to education, but the president decided that he didn't want to see funding go to certain programs and things. And Congress actually passed a law that said the president wants to withhold funds. The president only has 45 days. And during those 45 days, the president would need to convince Congress to actually change the funding allocation. Because again, Congress has the power of the purse, not the president. So if the president is unsuccessful in convincing Congress to take action, after 45 days, those need to be released. So I think there's more to be seen there. We saw the recent cancellation of the remaining education stabilization fund extensions. We saw that, I think 2 weeks ago, or maybe just last week, actually, the announcement from the DOE regarding the DEI materials and saying we're not going to release funds. So from a constitutional law standpoint, that there's only 45 days. Now we'll see how this plays out in the courts. I think there's been quite a number of state lawsuits filed or pending because of these existing withholdings or potential withholdings.
Right. This conversation is so important because it seems like there's such a swirl of information and people are reacting in many ways to it. What are you hearing as some of the reactions from educators to tech vendors?
Yeah, a few things. I think one, it's important to put federal education spending in context. How much does that represent?
Right.
So in broad strokes, federal funding accounts for about 11% of K-12 funding sources, with the remainder split roughly between state and local governments. Now, this doesn't This doesn't count the pandemic related funding, which we know is a significant amount
Right.
of one-time funding. So if you included that, it would be more towards like 14% of funding came from the
Oh,
Fed.
okay.
But in general, it's around 11. Now, this varies quite significantly from state to state and from region to region. So if you think about states like Mississippi, where 23% of their spending is federal funding, whereas New York, it's only 7%. So
Yes.
it can really vary pretty widely, but 11% on average is still a meaningful amount for districts that can impact how they support education. And I mean, if you imagine from your home budget or your company budget, if you had to cut 10% pretty quickly, that would be significant. So from a ed tech company standpoint, one of the things that I'm really encouraging folks to think about is, how do we support our district partners through this? What do we need to anticipate and what they're experiencing? So one of the things you want to think about is what kinds of districts are most likely to be impacted so we can anticipate. So the districts least likely to be impacted, those are going to be some of your affluent districts with high local property, tax base, where federal funding will only be maybe 5 to 10%. High enrollment districts, where they have diversified funding sources like grants or corporate partnerships, local state government contributions. So districts like Montgomery County or like Fairfax, those might be a little less impacted. And then like high investment states like New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, Illinois, they're going to be spending more from a state and local standpoint than states like West Virginia, New Mexico, Mississippi. Again, local demographics play a lot into this, but I think it's important we understand where we're going to see some vulnerability and where we won't. And the other thing that we talk a lot about is what are the kinds of products and services that might be affected so that we can think about how we anticipate. So the kinds of product services least likely to be affected, core instructional materials, those like math and literacy curricula, those are often paid for out of state instructional materials budgets. Essential systems like student information systems, assessment, summative formative assessments, and then products that might come off a state list, like say state adoption, or even through local ESCs and BOCES, they may be more important moving forward. On the flip side, the products and services that might be most affected, products like anything that's funded with Title I IDA Perkins grants, even if those funding sources don't change, don't decrease, I think it's the uncertainty with where are those going to live, to your point. Are those going to be block grants? Are those going to be at the Fed, at the state? When are those going to be dispersed? I think there's going to be some districts we're already hearing are putting things on hold a bit until we understand where and when and from where those funds will come. So I think there's still some risk around there. Supplemental programs, intervention software, tutoring after school, those may be a bit more vulnerable. And then CTE and career technical education and SEL may have some vulnerability there. So we're seeing companies that have a wide portfolio trying to lean more into those products that are less at risk. But for the smaller companies where they only have one or two products and really can't lean away from an effective product, stepping back and really adjusting their revenue forecast, adjusting their expense budgets so they can wait out what might be at least a few months of delays and getting some definitive answers there.
That's interesting. So districts right now are just kind of pushing the pause button.
Yeah.
It's kind of holding a little bit.
Yeah. We held a session about a week ago where we had 160 EdTech leaders on the call to really think about this together. And we asked the question, what are you seeing from buying behavior? Are they in holding patterns? Are they pushing things off? So a little over half said their districts were, for the most part, kind of in a holding pattern. They hadn't canceled opportunities, but they're waiting to learn a bit more. About a little more than a quarter said they were already seeing spending reductions, cutting back based on what they anticipate. About 10% said business as usual. I think that's very specific to the types of products, perhaps. But what I think was encouraging was very few, I think only 3% or so, were saying that their districts were unreachable, that they just weren't taking calls, they weren't having conversations. So at least there's some two-way dialogue about, okay, how can we support you? What's timing look like? How are you making your decisions? I think which is really important that there's that support from EdTech partners and dialogue with our districts.
Well, that's interesting also, because I think, and aside from the Department of Education, I think sales strategies are changing for the better in terms of relationship building. That probably makes a difference too for that two-way communication and for
Yeah.
that dialogue to remain open in these uncertain times.
Yeah.
So I think, that's, beneficial too. So now that ed tech companies have this data, what they're seeing from the
Mhm.
reactions of school districts, what are their next moves? What are they planning to do?
Yeah, a few things. And one, I just want to underscore a point you made about that, the importance of those relationships. And
Yeah.
I think as an industry, we learned a lot 5 years ago through what
Mm.
was so difficult in the COVID pandemic about how we engage with one another, how we support. And even in these times of uncertainty, just for ed tech vendors to reach out and say, we're here to support you. We're
Yeah.
here when you need us.
Mm.
We're willing to be patient, but you know, we're in your corner, and not saying, can you sign the PO? Where are we staying? It's
Right.
giving some grace and space because, gosh, as hard as it may feel and easy as we may feel as ed tech providers, it's dramatically more intense for educators who are
Right.
leading our school communities. So being able just to say, we're here, we support you, we're ready to talk when you are so we can help your students. So I think that's the first thing that we learned from that. And that's changing how we engage, in this, call it spring, summer. But the other things we're seeing is how companies are adjusting either their products or adjusting their go-to-market in this period. So we asked our members about product design. So given the executive orders regarding lesson material, whether it's equity or diversity, like things like race and gender, sexuality, how has this impacted their products? And we've seen some states where there's broad reaching interpretations of this. So they're pulling out passages about Rosa Parks because they're feared they're going to get singled out by the state or the federal government, or removing any lesson material that depicts people from LGBTQ plus communities. So how are our companies making these changes? Are they not making their changes and keeping their products as is? And what we found in asking our EdTech leader communities, about 60% are unlikely to make changes to their product. They're keeping it as is. The other 40 are likely or have already made changes, but what we found is 45% said they're unlikely to make changes. 15% said, no, we're not making changes to our product. Now, there's some products where it's not really relevant to them, right? If it's a robotics program, but those that have content that might fall into some of these policy and executive orders, they've said, no, we're actually not going to change our product. What we are seeing, though, is that they're changing how they go to market. So how they describe things in their messaging, in their
Mm.
positioning. So products like SEL, instead of calling it social and emotional learning, talking about the program in terms of resilience and communication, for example, or it describing, instead of a product focused on equity, it might be helping every learner succeed. So we're seeing companies really find ways to stay true to the spirit of the product, the spirit of what they're striving to do, but describing in a different way that may not disqualify them based on some of the very honed in buzzwords that the administration
Yeah.
seems to be focused on.
Right.
So
Right.
we're a lot more so we're seeing companies that are saying we're making changes to, or we plan to make changes. So about 60% said they're tweaking things a bit, but staying true to what they want to deliver and how they want to deliver from a product standpoint.
It's frustrating that they have to do that, but I think it's wonderful that they're able to still stay true to their core values and their mission and what they provide. And, maybe the language is, sharing that even more so. So the change of language, but it's frustrating having to choose
It's
or as
and
a team.
yeah, it has been frustrating for a lot of organizations. And again, we also understand it. The frustration and uneasiness in districts is far more intense.
Yeah.
But as company leaders, being tuned into that and based on all these factors of given the political environment, the pressures on organizations to change their products or even their values as an organization, how is that impacting morale and motivation?
Mm.
And it's having an impact. We saw About 75% of companies said that this is having an impact on a negative or significantly negative impact on morale and on motivation. Again, about 15% of the companies that were on our call and were surveyed don't have products that are quite as relevant to some of the executive orders, but so pretty broad impact on that. So given that challenging environment, as leaders, how do we find that right balance between optimism and realism?
Right.
Right? We don't want to paint things doom and gloom, but we also have to be realistic about the challenges that we're seeing and keeping our teams really focused for what can you control. So without seeming tone deaf, right? You can't just be all sunshine. You want to tone deaf from what's going on, but you want to lead your companies forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Another area that I'm seeing a concern in is innovation in education. I read an article yesterday. I'm from Kansas, and so our Kansas State Board of Education got together and, kind of had a session about where their goals are going to be in the future. From what I got from that article, they wanted to go back to basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and put off more of the SEL, as you said earlier, more of the innovation and the CTE, setting that aside. Now, for the last few decades as educators, we have focused on moving forward in that area, thinking that's the future. Are you seeing that there's a concern about the innovation in technology as we move in this era?
Yeah, I think when you focus on those areas that your state has called the back to basics, there can and should be innovation on how we deliver instruction and teacher support in those areas. I think that needs to continue to evolve. I think there's some concerns with when we see those cuts at the federal level in terms of measurement, in terms of innovation and guidance from EdTech innovation, that really pushes things much more down to local communities. So I think there's some risk there. So I think we'll need to really look inwardly as a industry, and that's districts and providers inclusive, how we continue to move that forward. That will certainly be a challenge. But I would suggest that, we don't think of SEL or CTE as separate. It's all connected. If our goal is to prepare students to enter the community, the society, the workforce, those things that we do in SEL or whatever you want to call it. Because I know even, in states that are saying they don't want to do SEL, they still actually embrace these resilience, communication, executive function kinds of programs that help us be successful individuals, that help us show up well in school and contribute to a school culture and community. I think it's related. When we think about CTE, how do we prepare students so that they have an idea of what the future looks like? So there's a shorter line between graduation and wage earning where they're applying those basic skills. So I certainly hope that we don't see a reduction in emphasis in those areas, because it is all, at the end of the day, I think what we all want, regardless of political party background, we want our students to graduate, be able to make their way in the world, in the community, in the workforce in a way that's really productive and suits them individually.
Absolutely.
We said that together, Jerry. This has been really great. And I really think it's what you have, your membership, your collective, is so important for the EdTech community. We're part of the EdTech community, and going to conferences and, being part of webinars and leading events that we do, we know how important community is. We know how important it is to link arms and work together. And I think it's so wonderful that you have this as part of your mission as well.
Appreciate the, I think it's in the industry, we think about how we engage and support those educator communities. And, we can count off all the different conferences and great environments, but there really wasn't that same environment for those of us who are leading EdTech organizations, whether it's the C level, the VP level, the director level. So creating spaces where we can be open and vulnerable and say, here's what I'm really struggling with. Have you faced a similar challenge? Help me see, my gaps, and where there's a collective interest in our shared success. So that was really something that was lacking in our space. And we've seen that based on just the enthusiasm and energy in what we've gathered each time.
How long has it been together?
So we launched the collective just about 2 years ago.
Okay, great.
And we have 11 different professional peer groups we're running focused on marketing, sales, product, customer success, and then at the executive level, but all with the same intent of creating those safe spaces to work together, safe space for productive struggle in some cases as we work through and really try and improve ourselves as leaders, how we show up, how we evolve, how we balance, how we show up at work and for our loved ones at home and balancing all of that out.
So important. I love it.
So
Well, thank you. Thank you for your leadership in this. And thank you for sharing all of this important information, this 360 view that, these impacts are trickled down and everyone's affected. So we appreciate your perspective and sharing all of your insights.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Jerry.
Yes. Thank you for the great information today, too. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.